Hello and welcome to Atlantic Debrief, the Europe Center's podcast on the most pressing issues affecting the transatlantic relationship today. My name is James Badgick, and I'm an associate director with the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. And we're really excited to be doing a mini-series of these debriefs following the release of our report, Transatlantic Horizons, a collaborative US-EU policy agenda for 2025 and beyond. And amid a year of elections and leadership turnover, this report looks to set a productive vision for transatlantic relations and offer a forward-looking policy agenda for the next U.S. administration and the next European Commission. And to discuss one of the pieces from the report, my guest today is Rob Murray, a non-resident senior fellow in the Forward Defense Program and the Transatlantic Security Initiative within the Atlantic Council Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. Rob also has over 10 years experience on the Secretary General's international staff at NATO and also served as the head of innovation at NATO, and prior served as a British officer for over 12 years. So Rob, a very warm welcome to you.
Thanks very much, James. Great to be here.
Rob authored a section of the report, Leveraging Europe in the EU as a Defense Power, which focuses on Europe's evolution as a defense actor and the necessary transatlantic coordination in this space. And this is a rising issue of importance for both the United States and the EU, and the US-EU relationship specifically, as Europe confronts its own security vulnerabilities and as the EU has itself started to think more strategically about what it can do in this space. And Rob, you have some very specific ideas for where the EU and the United States should start, notably on aligning their policies on funding, acquisition processes, and defense manufacturing. So I wanted to just start there and start with the basics and just ask if you can go into more detail on why you chose to focus on those three topics specifically. And then why should Washington and Brussels even care about aligning on them?
Yeah, thanks, James. So I think when we look at the defense and security challenges that are facing both Europe and the United States, when I really sat down and started to think about this, and it's just something been on my mind for a little while now, there's very few efforts, initiatives, activities that simply don't fall under one of these large areas to focus on, be that money, be that contracts, procurement, acquisition, or indeed be that production. And so if one is able to really start to use that as a framework, those three very large areas, and start to lean into chipping away at the challenges and problems there, then it's inherently going to bring about a greater level of transatlantic resilience and indeed deterrence that comes with that. So for me, when I sat back and thought about this and just tried to simplify all of the myriad of activities that are going on in the national security environment, those were the three. That's how I like to think about it in those three areas. And I think that the reason why this is important is that, for me at least, it doesn't feel credible or realistic to expect the European Union to be able to deal with Russia on its own, and perhaps other threats as well. And equally, the United States, having to deal perhaps with China on its own as well. Neither of these things feel realistic. It feels like there has to be greater levels of collaboration here. And the reason that when we think about, particularly, let's start with the money side, we have to recognize that we're really moving from an era where we're not really in a peacetime context anymore, whether that be in Europe with regards to Russia and Ukraine, in the Middle East right now, or indeed as tensions begin to sort of rise in the Pacific region. We're not in a peacetime environment. And that means that we're going to have to really reimagine how we leverage the genuine superpower that the United States and the European Union have. And that fundamentally is the dollar and the euro, respectively. And that means a real different way of thinking about money with regards to defense, and not looking at it perhaps from the context of a budget that is allocated based on tax and spend and based on fiscal policy. That's part of it. But thinking about how do we genuinely start to leverage market power to support hard power. And that's a discussion which I feel needs to start to be had. And it's really, when you look at the capabilities in terms of market power, the United States and European Union are very well versed to have that sort of discussion.
So Rob, maybe to pick up on the point where you mentioned about moving away from this peacetime thinking and the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, you do rightly note that the developments in Ukraine really served as a wake-up call, and highlighting both the strengths and the gaps in Europe's and America's funding preparedness, defense production. And I can maybe say when it comes to Europe's defense base, at least, we're not starting from nothing, but we're not exactly starting from the best spot either. So can you give us your assessment on some of the positive developments you've seen in the past couple of years as Europe and the United States have dealt with these new challenges, as you've mentioned, and then maybe what some of the lessons learned from these last couple of years need to be?
So when I think about Europe with regards to production, there's actually a really strong production base in Europe, whether that be, through Germany. Germany has a huge production capacity. Not directly related to defense, although, there are companies like Rheinmetall and others, which clearly are part of that. But equally Poland as well, huge capabilities to actually make stuff, produce stuff. And so when you look at the infrastructure necessary that is required to make the sorts of armaments necessary to defend Europe, the European Union, and indeed those other European countries that are no longer in the European Union, or just not in it full stop, including my own, there's a pretty decent production start point there. I think the challenge lies in twofold. One, how do you scale it? And two, how do you make sure there's the right sort of capitalization to support that scale? So the first point, how do we scale it? I think there's some great lessons coming out of Ukraine when it comes to the creative manner in which the Ukrainians have not only developed technology, but put in place a defense industry of really high caliber standing in a very, very short time frame. I think that is wildly impressive, and there's lessons there we can learn. Some of those lessons, for example, are around decentralization. So I would love to see a greater level of decentralized acquisition activity going on, such that then the people producing stuff, companies that make stuff, are able to get more contracts and have more certainty and enable their businesses to grow and actually produce for nation states. We have a very centralized acquisition model at the moment across the United States, across all of Europe, across all of NATO, actually. And that's kind of okay if we're talking about aircraft carriers, if we're talking about submarines, if we're talking about large armament programs that require a high degree of centralization. Even then, I think there's some debate to be had. But we should be really reimagining how we think about acquisition and production when it comes to software. And for me, it makes no sense to centralize that. For me, that should be absolutely decentralized. The Ukrainians have got this down to brigade level, sometimes down to unit level. Even at some points, I've seen data and evidence and research showing down to platoon level, where people are acquiring their own capabilities. And what that is doing is it's creating market forces, because the counter argument to this is, well, actually, no, we don't want to do that, because how will we achieve interoperability? How will we make sure standardization kicks in? Well, actually, it soon becomes very apparent to your corporals, your sergeants, your lieutenants, your captains, what works and what perhaps doesn't work. And therefore that market, those market forces will soon kick in. So I feel that some of the lessons coming out of Ukraine really should be adopted into wider efforts with regards to acquisition and procurement, but probably limited to software type endeavors. I'm not sure it makes sense for armaments. In terms of capitalization, where you do need lots of the heavy infrastructure to build ships, tanks, submarines, etc., it comes back to that first challenge. We talked about money, talked about procurement, talked about production. So we have to think about how we leverage market forces. And what I mean by that are capital markets. How we actually really start to bring about institutional investors and start to support the investment for building new factories, for investing in inventory associated to fast jets or submarines or what have you. At the moment, the entire industry, defense industry, works from a bespoke methodology. It's you win a contract, you build to that contract. Now that's fine. That's fine for peacetime. But when you're no longer in peacetime, and I don't believe we are any longer in peacetime, given what is happening in Europe, given what is happening in the Middle East, and given what may happen in the Indo-Pacific, I don't think we can define peacetime as perhaps we did 30 years ago. So when we're no longer in peacetime, that timeline to make stuff based on the current model doesn't really work. So we have to think about, okay, how can we perhaps securitize armaments? How can we leverage financial capital markets just as banks securitize mortgages on houses? How can we start to think about armaments and production and money markets in a very different way? And that's a real superpower that the European Union and the United States have. And that, to me, given, I don't want to say Ukraine is a blueprint for the future, but I think it offers signposts. And we should just follow those signposts to some extent and see how we wish to scale this. So there's some great initiatives and efforts going on in Ukraine when it comes to decentralization of software and also smaller stuff, drones being the obvious one. But more importantly, how we think about money for the capital investment that's necessary to achieve the level of deterrence required. That is the sort of thing which I think the new defense commissioner in the European Union, Andrius Kubilius, that is the sort of thing which he should be laser focused on, in my opinion.
So on the defense commissioner piece, and that leads us to a slight shift, but whenever we talk about transatlantic security, European defense architecture, we of course have to talk about NATO. And of course, you do note the role of NATO and specifically the interplay between the European Union and NATO in your piece. And this is obviously a conversation that we've been having for decades, and I'm sure we'll have for years to come. But maybe just give us your view of how do you see these two institutions interacting with one another in a way that is in harmony, or at the very least just isn't contradictory?
So I spent the best part of a decade in Brussels working in NATO, as you said, James, in your introduction. And there's always a little bit of friction. And that's kind of normal. You go to any administration and you have different departments, there's always a little bit of friction. And there is between the State Department and the Pentagon. In my country, there is between the Ministry of Defense and the Foreign Office. Right? There's always a little bit of friction. So first of all, we shouldn't expect some sort of perfect utopia with the European Union and NATO, because that's just not how organizations work. So first of all, let's just be realistic about that. But second of all, more positively, it makes a ton more sense to have a really strong European pillar within NATO. And I think we need to define what that means a little bit, because that phrase has been around for a long time. And so I see that, what does a strong European pillar look like? I see a strong European pillar that actually has serious financial resources committed to defense that go above and beyond the inflation rate of defense expenditure at the moment. What I mean by that, I use the example, just before the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 by Russia, a 155 millimeter artillery shell cost around about $2,000 roughly for one shell. Today, it's over $8,000. Right? That level of inflation is not necessarily sustainable. And so when you're seeing increases in defense spending from nations hitting their sort of 2% of GDP benchmark, that's great. We've got to recognize that, okay, the cost of stuff, armament, ammunition, weapons, etc., is going up significantly more. So a strong pillar in Europe, in NATO, I should say, a strong European pillar in NATO is about making sure we've genuinely got financial resources there to have some resilience there. It's also about properly leaning into interoperability and procurement efforts. So coming back to my three big pieces of the framework: money, procurement, production. The procurement bit I would love to see nothing else but Andreas and his new team in Brussels focus on procurement, trying to get this right, trying to produce a model whereby we can do rapid acquisition of whatever it might be. At the moment, no country really has got this nailed. We've built procurement systems for peacetime, but in my view, I don't think we can say we're in peacetime anymore. So that, more than anything else, is one thing which I believe he could have a real impact on. And what does that mean in terms of NATO? Well, it means that when Sakir puts together his plans, his war plans and so on and so forth, defense plans, then you've actually got the equipment, you've actually got the capabilities required, to support that. So for me, that is where those areas start to come into play. I think, the mission of NATO, when you look at its charter from 1949, it is not the same mission as the EU. The EU has a different mission. It's got a different setup. So there's always going to be a little bit of tension there. But I think to support that charter that NATO allies have signed up to, having just a much greater level of confidence and trust in those capabilities that they're going to be there as required to defend and deter, that is what we're talking about in terms of trying to strengthen that EU pillar, within a NATO context.
So Rob, final question for you. You have some great recommendations at the end of your piece. It's January 21st, 2025. We have a new U.S. administration. We've had a commission for a couple of months. For their first meeting, what are the top one or two things that you would recommend them to start doing or to do together?
So I think more than anything else, I'd love to see a initiative that brings about how we properly leverage money markets and market power to support national security and defense. I think this topic is siloed at the moment. It kind of sits within Treasury or finance ministries, across Europe. When we think about markets, that is, and when we think about money in the context of the Pentagon or Ministry of Defense, we think about a budget, and it's all about how do we slice and dice the budget. I would love to see a proposal to actually pull together some world experts from across economics, banking, national security, have a team of teams that actually looks at this, say, right, how do we properly leverage market power to support our national security ambitions at a transatlantic level? What does that look like? And not just things like sanctions and perhaps trade type endeavors and big macro activity. That's part of it, but I'm talking a much deeper level. Right? How do we start to use this such that commanders in the future can actually pull on a lever, and it's a market lever? Right? How do we get an admiral and a general to be able to get to that point? That is a element of power that we don't properly leverage in the context of national security, and I feel that now is the time to start to understand and explore how we can leverage that.
So Rob, thank you so much for joining me for this Atlantic debrief, and of course for authoring your essay as part of this report. To our audience out there, make sure you give the report Transatlantic Horizons a read, and in particular, make sure you read Rob's section closely, and stay tuned for more discussions with our other authors from the event, or from the report rather, and stay tuned, and until next time, goodbye.